still got folks joining us online, but we'll go ahead and get started. And respect to our speakers' schedule and agenda, which is very busy and getting busier. Welcome to the Fiscal Policy Study Group. My name is Juanetta Ayers. I'm the Executive Director for Commonwealth North. And I'm going to hand it off to Cheryl Frasca, who's our co-chair for the Fiscal Policy Study Group. Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you, Juanetta. Good morning, everyone. There was about, 30 people who had signed up. So there may be others who continue to join us this morning. But I want to welcome you to our kickoff session for 2023. We're looking forward to, I think, what's going to be a really interesting year. And we have a new co-chair for our study group. It's Jennifer Johnston, and we're really pleased to have her join us with her experience as a legislator and a member and leader in the House Finance Committee. So she'll bring that perspective to our work, and also her engagement really with her constituents. So that's also very important. So we've been, and I'll save the other chat till later so we can hear from Neil. But Neil, thank you for joining us this morning. We really look forward to your overview of the governor's proposed budget and appreciate any opportunities we might have going forward to continue to work with you on issues of interest. So I'll turn it over to you, Neil. And Juanetta will continue to moderate because she does such a darn good job. And so it's to you too.
All right. Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you, Juanetta. And thank you. I always enjoy the opportunity to come and speak with the group. And for those who don't know me from the past couple of years, I'm Neil Steininger. I'm the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. This will be my fourth session as director. So really looking forward to diving back in. I feel like we have a lot of kind of exciting things that are up for consideration this legislative session with the governor's carbon package. That's not really why I'm here to talk about, but it's just kind of one of the things that I'm a little bit excited about because it's such a new topic to learn about, and it's really a new opportunity for the state for us to look at here. But really my job mostly is on the budget side, how we're going to spend those revenues that we're looking at. And that's kind of what I'd like to go over today with the group. So to start, and just want to check, can everybody see the slides that I have up? Is that coming through just fine?
Yeah, you're in, you want to change your view mode, I think.
Okay, let's see here. That better? Perfect. All right. So just to start kind of looking at where we've been the last 4 years, kind of what we were able to accomplish in terms of the budget over the first term of the Dunleavy administration. So in 2019, we had a budget of about 4.8, getting a little bit close to $4.9 billion in unrestricted general funds. The budget that we put forward on December 15th is just shy of $4.8 billion. So about a $64 million reduction in unrestricted general fund, about 1.3% over that 5-year term. But what's kind of more interesting, I think, about that number than just that overall change is where that change occurred. So when you look at the strategies that we've used over the last 4 years, we've been making a lot of inroads to savings on statewide items, whether it's, nearly at this point, nearly eliminating oil and gas tax credits or slowly chipping away at state debt payments, and other just those kind of non-agency, non-service delivery to the public type costs that the state has to bear. We've brought those down a little over $300 million, roughly half of what they were in 2019. And then we've used those savings, or a portion of those savings, really to invest in some statewide agency operations in areas that, during the sort of extreme deficit years, a little bit prior to this administration, a lot of things had to be sort of chipped away at in order to meet kind of fiscal constraint in those years that maybe reduce service delivery to the public through areas like public safety, public protection, Department of Corrections, our investments in ensuring the state has rights to manage its own land. A lot of those things required some investment, and we were able to use savings in statewide operations to make those investments without growing the overall size of the unrestricted general fund budget. We've also seen a pretty big shift in the capital budget in terms of what you can consider really a baseline sort of bare minimum capital budget, if you will, what the core match to ensure that we're able to collect our federal programs. All of those things have gone up in the last year and a half under the infrastructure bill. Match requirements as a result of a growing allotment in the surface transportation program, the aviation program, as well as the Village Safe Water program, have really grown the required match in the state's capital budget. So as a result, you see a much larger capital budget in 24 than you did in 19. Part of that is also we have just a little bit more revenue around in order to be able to address some of those more nice to have investments for the state. On the revenue side, we have about a 3% increase in total revenue available for government. This is after adjusting for draws from the POMV that went to pay dividends. So the amount that's available for government. You can also see, though, down at the bottom, the increase in the amount actually being directed towards payment of dividends. In the 2019 budget, we had a kind of artificially constrained dividend through the appropriation process, and in 2024 we're proposing a full statutory dividend. You can also see, though, that we still have a bit of a deficit here in 24, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and about how we're going to manage that in a couple of slides. But there in 23, and that we had a pretty high revenue year here in 23 that we're projecting, and we should be able to make it through the year without a deficit. So I want to talk about a couple of challenges that we face as we're trying to put together the state's budget. And the primary one that I think has been most apparent in this last year as we looked at the fiscal year 23 budget in particular is volatility of state revenue. So what you're looking at here in this graph is at each date on the bottom, what the Department of Revenue projected we would collect in fiscal year 23. So this isn't actual revenue collections. It's just if on, say, July 15th, 2021, you asked Department of Revenue, what do you project for 23? It would have said a little over $2 billion. And so at that point, that's when we asked the agencies to come to us and give us their proposals for the fiscal year 23 budget. And so the fairly low amount of revenue that combined with the POMV revenue was definitely not enough to make ends meet at that point. And we had a little bit of an uptick going into actually releasing that budget. But then what happened is, as we all know, the war in Ukraine caused a pretty significant spike in price of oil, and as a result in state revenues. And so while the legislature was in session, they saw an increase from about $2.5 billion in traditional revenue to roughly $5 billion. So about a doubling of the revenue available to spend from what we had when we were building our budget here at OMB. And then once the legislature passed the budget, that revenue increased by almost another $1 billion before the governor actually signed the bill. And so the just different environment of projections we had at our hands when we were making decisions at each of these points, when all the different decision makers were making decisions, was wildly different information at each stage in the process. And then you can see, the governor signs the bill, and that happens to be the date of the highest revenue projection for fiscal year 23. So the information we had at that point was, massive surplus. Basically, we were going to put $1 billion into the CBR. We were going to put $1.2 billion into education funding. We had all these great things to put this money into savings. And then by the time, 2 short months later that we sent guidance out to agencies, that revenue crashed by about $2 billion. And so the thing I like to point out is from the day the governor signed the 23 budget to the day that he released the 24 budget, revenue for 23 revenue projections dropped by $1.8 billion. And that is about a third of traditional revenue. And so the challenges inherent in making any kind of long-term planning decision when we're so tied to such a volatile revenue source is pretty challenging. And that this graph of this sort of experience really informs why the governor is looking at some of these new novel alternative sources to try and address state revenues. Another challenge, on kind of a smaller scale, not on that big picture side, but on the smaller scale, is the challenge of vacant state positions. So any of you that work in a field where you're hiring people, where you're trying to get a workforce together to get a job done, probably have felt this same pain that the state has been feeling. We've seen an increased lengths of time to get a hire done, just in terms of trying to recruit, trying to find qualified applicants. Some of those recruitments don't even result in a successful hire. We've seen a lot more turnover, a lot more competition on wage, which is something that the state has a hard time being super responsive to. And we've just seen a much higher level of vacancy over the last couple of years than we had sort of in that pre-pandemic time period. You can see on this graph, there's a bit of a seasonality to the vacancy. During certain periods of the year, we have a lot more positions filled. We're able to bring people in. But in November of 2022, and I just late last night got new numbers for December, and they're pretty similar. But in November of 2022, we had about 16% of state positions were vacant and unfilled. And that's not to say that these are positions that we can really do without. So this creates a lot of challenges as we look at new money coming in from infrastructure bill for these projects that we have to manage, or these new investments that were made by the legislature last year when we had larger revenues. The ability to execute on those budget items, those appropriations, the ability to execute is pretty constrained and challenged. So we've seen in the agencies a lot more backlogs, a lot more delays, and that it makes it kind of challenging to figure out, okay, where is a place that we can actually invest money in the state that can be executed. Another challenge, and this one on a very specific program here, the Medicaid program during COVID received an enhanced match rate, or the federal medical assistance percentage. They had an enhancement of 6.2%. That resulted in $17.3 million in state savings per quarter. So savings is a bit of a misnomer there. Really, it's in state dollars that got picked up by the feds to account for kind of that increase in Medicaid need during the pandemic. On December 29th, so a little bit after we introduced our budget, the federal government authorized a phase out of that enhanced participation, and that'll happen over state fiscal years 23 and 24. So as we look at the Medicaid budget going into session and trying to understand, that large piece of the state budget, we know that we have, kind of more money that's going to come onto the state side of that program over the time period. And you can see, each quarter it kind of ratchets back up in terms of the state's share of Medicaid. But there is a piece of good news on this. The expiration of that enhanced FMAP and that expiration and the phase out of the public health emergency will enable us to start redetermining Medicaid eligibility. So during the pandemic, the state was barred from doing any kind of eligibility redeterminations, which means that anybody that got on Medicaid shortly before the pandemic or during the pandemic, even if they went and found employment or they became ineligible for some reason, if they had outside medical care that they were able to access, we weren't able to remove them from the Medicaid rolls. This means that we have a lot of cleanup work to do. So it's a good thing because we can get that program a little more aligned to the true need. But it is a bit of a challenge because, as we talked about on that previous slide, we have a lot of vacant positions, and, the Department of Public, or the Division of Public Assistance, is going to have a large workload coming onto them as they do these eligibility redeterminations. So now I just want to kind of talk about the sort of big picture of 23 and 24. And this is one half of our state fiscal summary. And it's got just a little more detail from that first slide that I went over. Here you can see between 23 and 24, the change in UGF expenditures. You can see that we're basically flat in non-formula costs within agencies. We've made a couple investments here or there and a couple of transfers in other places, but really kind of all trying to net out without a large change to state spending, trying to really reallocate resources rather than, create new spend. A big part of that is because we know, if we try to invest in new positions to do new work, we have those challenges in recruitment. Now might not be, the right time to actually be able to successfully implement something like that. We did see a reduction in agency formula. This primarily as a result of fiscal year 23 having additional investments in K-12 education outside of the normal formula, and the 24 budget just having a baseline of the normal K-12 formula. That really is the largest portion of that $52 million reduction there on the fourth row. On the statewide operations side, again, we have, you see kind of the bulk of that $300 million over the last 5-year reduction really is happening here in 24 as we see oil and gas tax credits expire. But there's also, some smaller reductions in total debt service. We had a small adjustment to our retirement payments, just as a result of kind of those actuarial calculations due to our market returns. In 23, in this slide, we're including a placeholder for supplementals. We know that we'll have a couple of significant supplemental needs in fiscal year 23. Wildfire suppression, we know in the fall, ended up going over budget by about $50 million just because of the size and nature of wildfires and the land that they were burning on over this last summer. So we do know we have a couple of pretty large items that we'll have to address in 23. So we've been trying to withhold a portion there in 23 to make it a little clearer on these. Down at the bottom, I'd like to kind of point out this $48.4 million because it is not really a number that most people were expecting to see. So when we passed the 23 budget, there was included a provision to forward fund K-12 education. On the reports at that time, that was shown as $1.2 billion of forward funding of K-12. And that would have allowed for payment in 23 to cover the FY2024 need for K-12 education. So basically giving 1 year forward of funding to that foundation program. The way it was structured in the appropriation bill, though, was just to allow any excess revenues in 23 to flow into that fund. Well, because of that $1.8 billion reduction in revenue from when we signed the appropriation bill, that number went from $1.2 billion in excess revenue going into the K-12 fund to just $48.4 million. So that is really all that's left of that effort to try and provide for that, funding certainty for K-12. And it's just the unfortunate nature of the volatility of our state revenues that resulted in it being, fairly de minimis amount when you think about the overall size of that program. Now here is our sources of funds. So above, expenditures are sort of the uses of funds, and here is how we're actually going to pay for those expenditures. So this is where you can see the traditional unrestricted revenue in 23 was about $3.9 billion. And in 24, we're projecting about 3.4. So a pretty considerable 12% decrease year over year in unrestricted traditional revenue. So that traditional revenue really is what's coming from, oil taxes primarily, and some corporate income tax and some other smaller taxes that we assess in the state. The POMV draw, however, is up 5%. We've had good market returns that get smoothed out over a 5-year average, but it is nice to see that come up a little bit to make up for some of the reductions in traditional revenue. We have restricted revenues, which are all of our federal programs and designated general fund sources or places where we collect fees to support a program. But the other piece that's a little bit interesting on the fiscal summary this year, as it was last year, are the draws, deposits, and adjustments. So in 23, we actually made some direct draws out of savings accounts. The statutory budget reserve was drawn on to fund a portion of the dividend payment that year. We also have prior year carry forward. This is just money that was appropriated in a previous year that can be used in that future year. There's about $12 million of that in 23. But the one that's been pretty interesting is the ARPA revenue offset. We received about $1 billion from the federal government that could be used pretty much as unrestricted general fund to the state. We code it in the budget to show that it is an offset from federal funds, and then discretely identify it here on the fiscal summary separate from normal federal funds because it isn't restricted in how we use it. We thought we were using up the last bit of it in fiscal year 23. However, as we reviewed the closeout of fiscal year 22, we found there's $10.6 million that just didn't get spent, that got lapsed as a result of just not having a position filled or some things that just couldn't be executed in time for the end of the fiscal year. So we've programmed that back into the budget. At the bottom line, we have about $7 billion in unrestricted sources of funds between traditional revenue and some of those draws. And that results in a deficit of about $265 million. So we're looking at drawing that deficit out of both the SBR and the CBR in the structure of our budget, of the appropriation bill. However, it's important to note that that is with a status quo revenue. So as we look at any of these carbon packages that the governor is going to be introducing to the legislature, that may make some significant changes to whether or not we have to make any draws from the constitutional budget reserve or the statutory budget reserve. Speaking of those reserves, we have kind of three primary savings balances that are, interesting to discuss. The K-12 forward funding, I had mentioned, really only $48 million got deposited in. We're using that $48 million to help address the fiscal year 24 K-12 payment, since it's really not a meaningfully large amount of money to allow for any kind of budget certainty for the districts, which really is why the districts have asked for forward funding. It's to have that budget certainty for them. $48 million really doesn't provide that certainty that they're looking for. So we felt it best to just use it to try and address some of that deficit that showed on the previous page. Then you can see here we're drawing the deficit first from the SBR. There's a little bit of money lingering there, and then from the CBR. These, of course, the balances assume no action on any revenue measures, and they're also based on unaudited financial data. So, they really, we've seen the CBR change by hundreds of millions of dollars with audit adjustments after the Division of Legislative Audit does their review of the state's accounting systems. And so, this could, shift up or down a little bit. It's basically the most certain number we have as of today. But when you look at, because we were able to make a pretty significant deposit into the constitutional budget reserve in fiscal year 22, these numbers, these reserve balances actually look much better than they have in recent years. And so we actually are ending fiscal year 24, even with a draw with over $2 billion in the CVR, which puts us at a much more stable position than the state has been in terms of, being able to know that we have some reserves to access should things, turn south again. So this slide is just a visualization of the relative size of the various state agencies. The kind of only interesting thing to point out here is that the Department of Health and Social Services used to be the largest bar here next to Department of Education, but because of the the split of the two departments into Department of Health and DFCS, it's kind of changed the shape of this graph slightly. But otherwise, it's still pretty predictable as to where our large outlays of money are. Department of Health really is the Medicaid program primarily. And then you have Department of Corrections, where it's pretty near 100% general fund funded agency to manage all those correctional institutions throughout the state. And then the university systems, unrestricted general fund appropriation is the next largest. A couple of high points. Our overall operating budget is down 4% since 2019. When you factor in capital, that the capital budget's up a little bit, but operating side is down 4%. So that's looking at agency operations and looking at those statewide items and debt service. And we've included a full statutory PFD as well as a full funding of the K-12 education formula. The base student allocation actually was increased by $30 through the reading bills during last session. We fully funded all of the municipal school bond debt, REAA, as well as the various municipal on behalf debt service payments. PCE and the scholarship programs are fully funded, and the oil and gas tax credits will be fully paid off in 24. Initially, we thought they'd be paid off in 23, but with lower revenue, that impacts that payoff calculation. We've made a couple of investments in various areas in the budget. One thing that is probably the most frequent response I get when I ask agencies, what's one of your biggest challenges in recruitment and retention? They say in rural areas, it's housing. So any agency that has a presence in rural Alaska has been adamant that housing has been one of the biggest impediments to their ability to recruit and retain staff. So this year we looked at the rural public professional housing program at AHFC that normally is limited to just health professionals and public safety and teachers. And it's normally funded in about the $1.7 million range. And so we talked to AHFC and said, can we expand this to cover all rural public professionals? So if Office of Children's Services or Fish and Game or any of these other agencies that have a presence in rural Alaska are having challenges with housing, providing them a program that they can access to address that. And then we also increase the amount of funding for the program. The Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development, we added a $5 million appropriation to restore some of the marketing and economic development efforts that they used to perform. Really, it's looking at how to market Alaska as a good place to come and do business. The WWAMI program, for those following this program, last year may recall discussion over expanding the number of seats in the program by 10. So we've taken that funding that was discussed last year, put it into the base budget, and also added $2 million in capital investments, because as we looked at that expansion, we found that the University of Alaska Anchorage didn't really have the space to create the students that would feed into the WWAMI program. So that pipeline wasn't really set up to manage that expansion. And so we're making that investment to ensure it's successful. We've got the Alaska Marine Highway System is currently fully funded in the budget. However, one thing to note is the federal funding that came through the infrastructure bill still remains a little bit uncertain. The state is still in discussions with the FTA about how that program should be managed and how to access as much of that money as we can in order to support the marine highway system. We've also made $4 million in investments in sanitation at public parks, as well as building some new cabins at public parks, with a focus primarily on cabins that will be accessible to disabled Alaska residents. So things a little bit closer to the parking lots with wheelchair ramps and designed a little bit more so that every Alaskan can enjoy some of the parks rather than just cabins that require significant mobility to get to. And then we have $2 million for the Business Enterprise Program. So this is a program at the Department of Labor that provides assistance to blind and disabled owned businesses for startup costs. For those that have been following the budget for the last several years and are aware of the CBR sweep, the CBR sweep, when the reverse sweep wasn't enacted, it actually swept all of the funds that fund the Business Enterprise Program. So that program was funded through a portion of revenues from those blind and disabled businesses that pay back into the program to then kind of pay it forward to help support future blind and disabled businesses and startup costs. That fund was considered sweepable, and so was emptied, effectively, taking that nest egg that was there to support these blind businesses. And so we've added $2 million into the budget to make that program whole and to help fund some of those startup costs. We've made continued investments in statehood defense. So this is the governor's program to ensure that the state has full access to its rights to make decisions regarding the development and implementation of state lands. So we have $10 million for funding for litigation, expert witnesses, or outside counsel in areas where we may need to engage in lawsuits or legal actions against federal overreach into state activities. We're also funding money for fish and game wildlife research. This provides the necessary science to show, what areas should and shouldn't be developable and make sure that we have adequate science to defend our decisions. And similarly in DEC for air quality monitoring, trying to achieve that same end goal. In the Department of Health, we are putting $9.5 million in to try to address congenital syphilis and tuberculosis, as well as expanding the Medicaid program to postpartum mothers. Expanding that to ensure that we don't have, individuals in the state with what should be easily treatable diseases, or in situations where not having access to medical care can create a true impediment to the health and success of a family. We also have some investments in food security. So within fish and game and DNR, there's about $4.6 million for research into new fisheries, wildlife, as well as investments in livestock and DNR. There's $3 million for power infrastructure to expand farming in the Delta Farm region, and $3 million for a produce processing plant at the Point McKenzie Correctional Institution, which will allow them to freeze the produce that they grow there and then distribute it throughout the correction system, which will save money and reduce some of the pressure on other sources of food in the state. In public safety, we've been adding new trooper positions over the last several years. Many of them have not been fully funded by the legislature, or in some cases, we've not put them forward as fully funded. And really that's because we know it takes some time to actually fill those trooper positions. Recruitment for those positions can be a time-consuming and challenging process, but we've seen a lot of success in that. And so in the 24 budget, we feel confident in fully funding those trooper positions as we are seeing them getting filled. But as we fill those positions, we've realized the need for additional support positions to allow those troopers to really focus in on public safety work. So you'll see a large investment in support positions within the Department of Public Safety. There's also a number of capital investments in the department, between a fairly large investment in an IT system for the criminal justice systems, as well as some necessary maintenance on trooper posts and the training academy. We also have in the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs $2.5 million for the Alaska State Defense Force. So what this program is, if you recall, the typhoon that hit Western Alaska required a lot of response, more than what necessarily just the National Guard could provide. And the Alaska State Defense Force is really the group of volunteers and individuals who the state can call upon in those situations to send out and provide response and relief in emergency situations where it may or may not be appropriate to send the National Guard, or where the National Guard may need some additional assistance. So we're making an investment to expand the Alaska State Defense Force and provide some additional equipment and additional training time for those individuals to make sure they're as ready as they can be when the state needs to call on them. We're also making an additional investment in the drone program at the university. We've seen good success in their use of the $10 million investment from the last budget cycle, and are really looking forward to the things they can do to expand opportunities for use of drones for all sorts of different functions in the state of Alaska. And now my final slide is probably a little bit too small on your screen because it's just a bit of a wall of numbers. But this is a clip from OMB 10-year plan. I'm not going to go over every number, but kind of the important thing to point out here, when we look at state spending into the future, in the 10-year plan, we provide for somewhat constrained growth in expenditures. So we usually use about 1.5% expenditure growth rate. The reason for that is we know that some programs will expand with cost pressures. Others, may be temporary programs that can be, eliminated or adjusted as time goes on. And as we deal with the level of revenue available, we usually have to make pragmatic decisions in how to address funding. And so, we make sure to include enough room to provide for needs in the future, but not show unconstrained excessive growth. On the capital budget, what we're showing here is really that $220 million in 2025, what we consider to be sort of a bare minimum capital budget that covers match and has a little bit of money for some additional needs, whether it be deferred maintenance or other capital needs. And then we grow that by that same growth factor out into the future. This 10-year plan does include a full statutory dividend in every year of the plan. And at the bottom line, with that full statutory dividend, with current status quo projected available revenue, there's a pretty significant deficit through the entirety of the plan. And so that's why we've added this new revenue target row to the 10-year plan, to show how much revenue really is necessary in order to have a stable fiscal plan that is able to balance revenues against expenditures and able to maintain a savings reserve balance of about $2 billion through the end of the 10-year forecast period. And the important thing here is that, without having any addressing of revenues, without, looking at these carbon packages, looking at other ways to address revenue in the state system, we would end up eliminating our state reserves by 2027 through deficit draws. It would jeopardize the ability to pay any level of PFD, and require significant reduction in public services. And that's why really that new revenue target is very important, because if we're able to address revenue through a way that doesn't create harm to the state, We'll be able to maintain a healthy CBR balance. We'll be able to provide for a full statutory dividend that, is, really what the priority of the governor and the priority of the people. And we'll be able to provide for some conservative gross and level of services to the state, whether that's, education, whether that's changes in Medicaid enrollment, whether that's, investments in public safety and public protection. It will provide for our ability to address some of those needs. And so I think that really, as I said earlier, the thing that I'm most excited about this session is watching those carbon packages move through the process and seeing how that can evolve and create a new opportunity for the state. And I encourage all of the folks on this call to educate yourself on those and get better understanding, because it's really an opportunity, in this arena for the state to be able to address some of the needs that we've had. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. And again, thank you for the opportunity to present.
So Neil, on the challenges of hiring folks, has there been any discussions with the labor unions about the potential to outsource some of the work? Because as I recall, I assume that's still the case, the collective bargaining agreements have a lot of sideboards on that limit the state's ability to do that. But given the circumstances, is there any shift in using that potential tool?
So the way that works right now under those bargaining unit agreements is that the state has to perform a feasibility study on, whether or not outsourcing is appropriate. We did see some success when we were under the emergency declarations during COVID. That allowed us a little bit more of a streamlined process there to be able to outsource and to be able to address those needs. I know that in some of these more painful areas, we've had those conversations around, doing the feasibility studies, trying to figure out what the best way to address the need is, because there are some areas where try as we might, we can't fill enough positions to get the work done. So I think, there does need to be that conversation of what's the best route. I do understand, the perspective of wanting to have a state employee do the work, because it is a state responsibility. But in a lot of these situations, we can't get the staff to get the work done, and so we do need to look at some of those kind of maybe less traditional ways of going about that.
Right.
A little different than the state has had in the past. Yeah.
Who's the lead on exploring that? Is that the Commissioner of Administration?
Yeah, so that really fits under the Division of Personnel within the Department of Administration, who would be really taking point on that. We've been, we obviously here at OMB are, very hands-on with Department of Administration, because that impacts, when we put money into the budget, we want to see it executed on successfully. And so if we can't get people to get the work done, that is starting to become a challenge in some of those areas.
Right. Did you take additional vacancy savings in the 24 proposed budget to reflect?
So the strategy that we've gone with there, because we know that there are a lot of unfilled positions, and we know that we actually lapsed a lot of money in 22 as a result of unfilled positions. And so you might recall from your OMB days, we have some mechanisms that when you don't spend personal services money, we can first use some of it to bolster our working reserve, which pays for workers' comp and things like that, and then bolster what's called group health life, which helps keep down our health insurance costs. So we were able to maximize both of those because we had so many vacant positions and still lapse in the order of $40 million in 22. Going into 24, because really the goal is to get the positions filled. We've spent the last 8 to 10 years as a state going through budget reduction exercises, finding those positions that aren't really necessary to get the work of the state done and eliminating those positions. And at this stage of the positions we have remaining are really, they're mostly really true needs of the execution of the core mission of state government. And so the challenge in trying to take savings in the 24 budget related to vacant positions is, we're sitting here telling every agency, get that position filled, do whatever you can to get the position filled, whether it's through a recruitment bonus or whether it's through, kind of changing some of the working conditions to make it more attractive. So if we're telling them that, but then we take the money that they would use to pay that position out of the 24 budget and put them in a situation where they would need a supplemental, it's a little bit counterproductive to getting the job done. And so that's why you don't see as many, reductions from vacant positions in the budget. But what you do see is a lot of areas where we're looking to recruit a new position, but maybe didn't add a PCN, or add a PCN, but didn't add as much funding as it necessarily might cost. And in those situations, what we're doing is working with the agency to say, you have this group of positions that we don't want to defund because we know the work needs to be done, but we don't want to artificially inflate the number of state positions stated in the budget report. So maybe take that position, move it over to this other division. You can't really transfer the money because of the way the appropriation laws work. But move that position itself and then try and hire it in this other function. And when you're able to hire, we'll start adding the positions. And so there's a little bit of a weird disconnect between, position counts in the budget and what the agencies are funded to try and do. But we're just trying to manage to a more realistic number of positions that we think we can actually fill, but not tie the hands behind the back of the agency as they're trying to execute on their given programs.
Yeah.
It's a challenging time.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you, Cheryl. Neil, we have a sort of a related question, and I think this is Jennifer Johnston, but Jennifer's online with us, and she's asking that, budget performance measures include certain legal requirements, legal mandates, and if you've reviewed how those vacancies are impacting meeting those legal requirements and any impending liabilities. Of course, we're hearing in the media stories about backlogs in case processing in some departments, and in other states, when those circumstances have happened, states get sued. So she's asking, have you looked at the impact on those vacancy rates? What maybe impending liabilities may be incurred? And I think you've already addressed this to some degree. How does that affect the budget vacancy factors? So,
and so the budgeted vacancy factors that we list in our OMB reports really are more of a reflection of what we would consider a healthy level of turnover to be. So when we say a component has a 5% budgeted vacancy factor, that means that we expect 1 out of every 20 positions to be vacant in any given month, but probably not the same position months over months. It's sort of just a way to say, hey, we know there's always going to be some positions vacant. But then when you see 16% are vacant, that well over and above a natural rate of turnover. So it's not necessarily that budgeted vacancy, it doesn't correlate to what's actually happening. It's kind of a planning tool. But regarding the kind of, performance and liability of non-performance when we have vacant positions, that is definitely a concern. That's why we've been looking at, things like recruitment bonuses in areas where we know there's a key, need for public protection and public safety and corrections, or the bonuses that we're trying to work through with Office of Children's Services. And so, as we see those areas creating the more painful inability to execute on the program, that's where we see it appropriate to maybe create some of those incentives that are a little bit above and beyond what we're kind of normally used to in government.
Thank you. Gunnar Knapp is also online with us today, and he is asking about how your projected revenues and deficits change under, different oil prices. And I'll just jump onto that. I looked it up while you were presenting. The EIA is projecting an average per barrel rate of $83 for 23 and 78 for 24. And also stating that there's usually a $2 per barrel discount for Alaska North Slope crude off of Brent. Those are Brent numbers. So, that suggests that our deficit situation is growing. Maybe you could respond to that.
So the most recent revenue update that I've received was roughly equal to the fall forecast. They do a monthly update, and then we release it publicly if it diverges by a large amount. But this one was basically within a rounding error of the same. I have been watching, of course, oil prices fluctuate on a daily basis, and know that when you looked at that graph on one of my earlier slides, from that experience of last year, we kind of know that that's something that we might have to deal with. And I always know somebody asks a question, and I should have looked up before, so I'd have what this year's, revenue per dollar of oil price sensitivity is. I want to say in the $70 million range, but I didn't look it up before this, and I don't have that memorized in my head. But in about 7 minutes, I think Dan Stickle and the Department of Revenue will be up in Senate Finance, and I'm sure somebody will ask them.
That's great. That's great. So a question from Kai Holland, who's on with us, is there any funding in the carbon credits that will, let's see, how's he phrasing this? Well, let me rephrase it a little bit. As a potential new source of revenue, I think the question is, how quickly can it be operationalized? And you're anticipating that perhaps there may be some new revenue from that. In when do you see that beginning, and how do you see that flowing out over the 10-year forecast?
So the carbon packages right now that we're working on, we're still, getting the drafts together for introduction to the legislature, and the Department of Natural Resources is the primary agency looking into how it actually will end up being executed. And so a big piece of this is just getting enabling legislation for us to even, engage in these markets. So it's really hard to say at this point, until we've really had some conversation with the legislature of how to structure this, sort of when and how much revenue would come in. The information that we included in the 10-year plan is not an analysis of specific carbon revenues. Really, what we're trying to illustrate is how much revenue the state needs to generate in order to maintain that status quo level of spending. It's really a target of revenue. And there is, some of the early information that we had that I think the governor discussed a bit in the press conference on December 15th. There are some high side numbers that are well in excess of what we're on that 10-year plan. And then there's also, some constrained estimates out there as well. But it's really, at this stage, until we really have the ability to openly engage in the market, it's going to be hard to tell how much revenue there will be coming in. But definitely excited for getting those bills out into the legislative process and getting a lot more information on how large that market out there is, because it is a pretty new, novel type of revenue for the state.
Gunner's posting a lot of philosophical questions, and I'm going to try and stick to the more maybe focused on the presentation in terms of so you don't include any new broad-based taxes that Alaskans would pay, or is there any consideration for broad-based taxes in the future? Is the carbon credit revenue going to be the only proposal from the administration?
So I mean, really the focus here on the carbon revenue, I mean, when you think about it as a way to generate state income, it's a way to generate state income without creating any kind of imposition on any individual Alaskan. And that's the primary difference between it and any of the other revenue measures we've discussed as a state in the past. Is all of those previous revenue measures either had an imposition on a specific industry, an imposition on individual Alaskans, or some other kind of negative impact on the state economy as a whole and on individual Alaskans. And this carbon revenue measure, the concept here is we're creating something entirely new. It's not trying to extract value out of an existing economy. It's an expansion. And that's really, why you don't see other traditional broad-based taxes, is because they're extracting something out of an existing economy. The governor's philosophy is that he doesn't want to, generate harm in the way that we finance government. And so looking at something novel and new like this that generates something new for the state is a new opportunity, is a new way to generate income for the state without, going to an individual Alaskan or extracting money out of an existing system. And that's why you won't see, within that package a broad-based tax there. Okay,
thank you, Neil. You mentioned that the base student allocation effectively had been increased by $30 with the Reading Act that was passed last year. And there's certainly, again, in advance of the session, been a lot of discussion about the base student allocation and the sufficiency, the impact of all of the things that we've already talked about today, the labor market and wage pressure. Is there any consideration for, how do you think that the negotiations will go between the administration and the legislature with regard to the base student allocation?
Mm-hmm. There's definitely consideration of that. I mean, we've not been blind to what's going on with all the school districts throughout the state in terms of, the struggles that they've been having, especially coming out of COVID, as a lot of those federal dollars that really helped support some of the districts are starting to expire. And as I think most of you would have heard during the governor's remarks on December 15th, he made very clear that, while we included the base student allocation fully funded in this budget, we know that's a starting point of the conversation this session. And we know that there is a lot of discussion on, is that appropriate? Is that adequately funding education? And our Department of Education Commissioner Teschner and her whole team, or I guess Acting Commissioner Teschner and her whole team, they're all there and ready to have those conversations and figure out exactly how to structure this and how to make sure that we're funding adequately and make sure that any solution is actually going to address the true problem and is not just just throwing money at it, but that we're providing adequate money to get the services done, but doing so in a smart way. So we're definitely looking forward to that conversation this session. We know that's going to be one of the big ones over the next couple of months.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll love to follow along on that. Neil, we had a presentation from now former Senator Natasha von Imhoff a week or so ago, and discussed some of these same issues she presented on her perspective on the FY24 budget. But one of the key things that I think she reached in conclusion was that that there are economic opportunities that we have in the state of Alaska that we're not getting to because we're not prioritizing investing in new opportunities or creating public-private partnerships because we don't have the skin in the game to make some of those co-investments. And she mentioned a large number of them. One of the things that the state does in partnership with the Economic Development Administration is publish a comprehensive economic development strategy. And you may or may not be familiar with that, but it does anticipate that the state would pursue economic growth and invest in certain areas in the state. And can you talk about how the budget may or may not support some of those things with some of the investments that you have prioritized?
Mm-hmm. So, well, I'm not super familiar with that report itself. One thing, to point out that we are doing is trying to rebuild some of that activity in the Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development, where the last two words of their department name really haven't been effectively funded for the last several years. And so you see there's a $5 million appropriation there to try and restart some of those efforts and try to build out some of that network again, to build out that ability of the state to see where those opportunities are. And I'd say that commissioner, she's confirmed last session, she's very energetic about getting out there and marketing the state. And I am very much looking forward to what she'll be able to do with that money once it gets appropriated to her. And I think that's one area where we're trying to get a better idea of what's out there to do. We've also, within some of our, food security initiatives, part of that is looking at how do we attract in businesses into the state to address that may not be traditional food business. And so looking at other economic development opportunities there, there's a lot of our statehood defense in some ways really is looking at how do we create an environment that's good for business in the state that shows that we're there to support development and economic activity in any way that we can. So I think there's a lot of investments that we've made over the last several years in the budget, as well as investments in the budget in 24, that while on their face, maybe in just the name in the budget line may not look like it's economic development, an air quality monitoring station in DEC may not look like it's economic development, but in effect, it actually is. It's creating an environment where Alaska can have control over our ability to ensure that people can come up here and do business. And whether that business is one of our traditional industries or whether that business is something entirely new, we're trying to create through these investments that opportunity there for folks.
Okay, thank you. Neil, could you maybe speak to, I'm gonna come right back to you, Cheryl, but just one last follow-up on economic development. My understanding is the state tourism marketing program was not included in the program, which has been a substantial investment in prior years. Could you speak to what the rationale or thinking was behind not including statewide tourism marketing?
Yeah, so we had a number of things like that were fairly hard decisions that we had to make. When you saw my slides at the end, even after, kind of playing every budget trick we could, we still ended up with a budget deficit of about $265 million. And with that size of a deficit, there were definitely some things that we really would have liked to have invested in that we simply just could not make fit. As we look forward, if some of these carbon measures and revenue ideas can generate enough money that we can come back to the table and look at some of those things that we had to sort of leave to the side, we certainly, are open to doing that. And that's going to be part of the discussion coming after we're able to work through the carbon package with the legislature.
Okay. Okay, Cheryl, I'm going to bring you back on, and you can do a closing question for Neil.
Well, that's okay. I first want to clarify. I know the meeting announcement said we were going to 9:30. Is that? But we've always just gone to 9. So
yeah, just we've always run a little bit long on these sessions, so I did schedule in some additional time, but we are starting to see folks dropping off. So
right, because I think they're used to the 9 o'clock. Okay, and so as a result of that, I'll just briefly state my questions, my comments / kind of a question. But on the new term of putting DGF in as a restricted revenue, in terms of your categorization, I saw that Revenue Department had done that several years ago. But what you've basically done is taken half of the spending off budget in terms of how it's presented for the department's funding. And so I think that's really a bad trajectory in terms of using political definitions to pretend like departments are hardly getting any money. So I know, Neil, that's not this administration didn't start doing that, but I do think it's distorting the revenues available to pay for services because they've been politically defined as DGF. And so anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Okay.
I'll jump up on the soapbox with you, actually.
Yeah, it just galls me. So because you hear it repeated by legislators about, oh, look how little departments get compared to the dividend. And anyway, that's a whole nother subject. But anyway, so I'm glad to hear you're aware of it.
Yeah, and I will say, that there is a bit of a storied history on that. In the FY20 budget, we attempted to, in our OMB reports, shift DGF over to be merged in with UGF to show state spending, because DGF, right. You're right, DGF is a political definition, but it is still state revenue subject to appropriation for any purpose. And so it's fungible, it is state money for any purpose. Some of it is, fees collected for services rendered. There is a decent portion of it that's that, but by and large, it's state revenue, and it's just been listed to have a designated purpose in statute. So when we made that attempt in 2020, it went over very poorly across the street. And so in subsequent years, we have avoided the drama of trying to merge those together and left it as separate as DGF. I do occasionally have conversations with Leg Finance about how do we make this a little clearer, because some of those items in DGF, they are revenue a state agency has to go out actively collect, as a fee for service. And that does deserve a different classification than something like, say, alcohol tax, where the agency, has nothing to do with the collection. It's a pot of generalized state revenues that then gets spent on programs, and then in all of our budget reporting, we segregate it out. And so there's some nuance in there that I'd love to take an interim one of these years and work through with Leg Finance, so then we can come to it on the same page and avoid any drama. Because I do agree with you, it doesn't paint the entire picture, but at the end of the day, the unrestricted general fund is where the most discretion is for the legislature. And so there is some logic to that being, broken out pretty discreetly.
Sure, but you can still present the information and how it's interpreted. But back in the olden days, originally, like park fees were designated just as information for the legislators to see how much Parks was generating. It wasn't intended to be a dedicated stream of revenues. But anyway, okay, off of that soapbox. But we are going to schedule, Juanetta is going to schedule a session on the carbon tax credits. And so we're looking forward to learning more about that. So we appreciate your initial comments about it. So it'll be interesting to learn more. Let's see, next week we're going to have Alexi Painter from Ledge Finance talk about his insights into the budget. So we appreciate your time, Neil, this week, and we'll look forward to hearing Alexi. And we're then in February going to start trying to have both in-person and Zoomed meetings. So they're what do you call that? They're hybrid meetings. So with that, we'll let Neil go. We'll let Neil go so he can do his real job. And again, Neil, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and your insights. So hope to have more conversations later.
Yeah. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Juanetta.
Thank you.
Okay,
Neil.
thank you. Bye. Okay,
Yeah.
Juanetta, did you have more?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that with the February sessions, we will be moving to a noon meeting time as opposed to at 8 a.m. Part of that is to meet in person again. We're dealing with, ongoing restrictions to the donated meeting facilities that we use. And some of them are not available at the 8 a.m. timeframe. So we're going to switch to a noontime session. So we'll send out notices about that. And I'm also just going to invite, I don't know, Jennifer's still online with us or not. We had some additional comments. But anyway, we appreciate everybody's thoughts, suggestions, questions. Please feel free to contact me at exec@commonwealthnorth.org if you have any ideas or suggestions. And there is a question about Natasha's presentation. It is available online at commonwealthnorth.org. The video is linked on the homepage, and the video and slide deck are available under About What's New. So those are all available. And if you weren't able to attend that session or haven't already viewed it, please do take a moment to take a look at that.
So one of Neil's presentation today, will that go up on the website? And if so, where would someone find it?
When I post it to YouTube, every new video is automatically on the homepage at commonwealthnorth.org, and it will be archived on the Fiscal Policy Study Group webpage, both the video and the slide deck. So always look for it either on the homepage or on the study group page.
Okay, and for next week, if anybody's really ambitious, Ledge Finance does post on its website the Ledge Finance's overview of the governor's budget. So if you want to get a head start, you can do so. And they also have the reports that they do on each department's budget. So lots of information if you're so inclined. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it. And stay tuned.
Thanks,
Thanks, Juanetta.
Thanks, Cheryl. Appreciate it.